another burning issue, I am utmost glad to welcome on stage Clemence Poirier. Welcome, Clémence Poirier. You are a senior Cyberdefense Researcher at ETHZ Zurich, and you will be talking about cyber operations against the space sector in the Israeli-Palestine conflict.
Thank you very much, Margot. So indeed, I'm doing research on space cybersecurity and more precisely on cyber operations against the space sector in the context of armed conflict. So previously, I looked at cyber operations against the space sector in the war in Ukraine. And at this point, we are over 170 cyber operations that were conducted for motives related to that conflict. And so that's something that is very new in the threat landscape. So I tried to look at other armed conflict to see whether that's a trend, whether now we're seeing cyber operations against the space sector in all armed conflicts or geopolitical crisis, so that the space sector could take mitigations and follow geopolitical developments so that they can prepare. So the findings that I will present here today are preliminary findings of a study that I will release in a few months. So some of the final results may change, and it's also always great to gather feedback from the space community so that I can improve the results. So why did I start to look at Israeli-Palestine conflict? So of course, that's one of the main crises that is happening right now, but I also noticed some similar things with the war in Ukraine. So I thought that was something that could be interesting to look at. So first, there were some similar start to the war in Ukraine, because on October 7, there was, in complement to the operation on land, some cyber operations that took place. So you can remember that with the war in Ukraine, there were the attack against CYSAT in the early hours of the invasion. So we see some similarities. Also, what I noticed in my research on the war in Ukraine is that pro-Russian and pro-Palestine activist groups decided to sign partnerships and alliances to conduct operations together. And among those pro-Russian groups that signed alliances, there were also Russian groups that targeted the space sector in the war in Ukraine. So I wondered, could they target the space sector together and pool their resources to do that? And would they also target the space sector in Israel-Palestine? And of course, as a researcher, we're always looking for topics that are not covered in the literature, and that is the case of this topic. There's no studies about this, so it's always interesting to study. So did I find any operation? Well, actually, quite a lot. So I found 117 cyber operations that were conducted explicitly for motives related to the conflict. And it's really important to note that it's only open source information. So there's always a biases when you build databases. It's never perfect. You always have bias. There's always things that you don't see. You don't have a perfect picture of the threat landscape. There's a lot of information that are not publicly available, especially about state activity. So it's really important to keep that in mind when you look at data. So here I'm mostly looking at Telegram channels of hacktivist groups, news article, reports, public attributions that are made by state agencies, etc. So you see over time that there is definitely an increase in operations. Operations against the space sector started before October 7, and you see from 2023 that there's definitely a sharp increase in operations. It's mostly DDoS attacks against websites of space companies, space agencies, and a lot of data leaks that are published on the dark web. So there's almost no publicly available data, almost no operations that actually targeted the satellite in orbit, and almost no operations that target the ground segment, which is always a prime target for threat actors. So in publicly available data, there's still very limited data on actual user segment or ground segment. So there's, in the end, little effect on actual space systems of those operations. But it doesn't mean it does not have some kind of effects. It's just that the effect is usually on the IT environment of space companies and space agencies. And in this data sets, there's also no inclusion of jamming and spoofing, which I considered electronic warfare in these methodologies. In the data set, I found that 43 different space entities were targeted by cyber operations in the conflict. Mostly, the most targeted entity is Rafael, an Israeli aerospace and defense company that also operates satellites. NASA, unfortunately, in all armed conflict, is targeted. The Israeli Space Agency, ELTA System, ISRO, the Indian Space Research Organization, was heavily targeted for motives related to the conflict, but I will come back to that later. So you see that most targets were actually focused on a few selected entities. So that's also something interesting that may evolve in the future. When it comes to countries that are targeted, it's mostly Israel, the US, India, the UK, and the UAE that are targeted by mostly hacktivist groups. So again, this might be a bit biased because it's only open source information. So maybe when you have access to information that are not public, maybe the countries that are targeted look different. But with open source info and hacktivist activity, that's what you get. So now when it comes to threat actors group, I found over 50 hacktivist groups that targeted the space sector in the context of the conflict. So you really have hacktivist groups, mostly on Telegram, that are taking sides for one side or another and conducting operations. What is interesting here is that in the context of pro-Palestine hacktivist groups, they come from various countries, and you see probably in the name where they come from. So this is very international. Also, what we can notice here is that there's clearly quite an imbalance. And this is very difficult to understand why there is such an imbalance, because for the war in Ukraine, it was very different. So I tried to investigate why there was so little hacktivist groups from Israel. So from open source information, what we can see is that there's different access. So Israel did not really manage to channel and have some kind of uprising of hacktivist groups, but there's different reasons for that. So Israel controls internet service providers in Palestine. So for at least 19 Palestinian internet service providers, they rely on Israeli or foreign internet service provider. So basically, Israel already has access to the internet infrastructure in Palestine. So that means that there's not really anything to hack. They already have access to communication. Then there's different attack surface. So when you compare with the war in Ukraine, you have with Russia, Ukraine, a space power and an emerging spacefaring nation. Both have a space industry. They both have agencies and so on. So you have a lot of potential targets to attack. For Israel-Palestine, you have one emerging spacefaring nation, which is Israel, which has a small space sector, and you have Palestine that does not really have a space industry. However, there are satellite services that are being used in Palestine. You have satellite phones that are being used. You have a bit of satellite TV. You have a bit of internet broadband for some services. So there are some space services in use, but they don't really have a structured space industry. So you have different attacks. So that can also explain why there's little things to target. Then you have different mobilizations. So Israel did not really manage to channel pro-Israel hacktivist groups. You don't really see so many groups. There were some. I checked about 300 groups overall, and only 50 targeted the space sector. So there, I checked about 20 different Israeli, pro-Israel hacktivist groups, but I couldn't find any examples of attacks against the space sector. But if you have any data, feel free to share that with me. And also there's different levels of visibility. So you see that you don't see a lot of public information when it comes to state activity. So states are not really communicating on their operations, so probably it's something to take into account and is probably biasing the data set. So now let's look at some actual operations. So one of the few examples of attacks that actually targeted space systems, here the user segment is GovSec, which targeted GNSS receivers in Israel. We don't know which receivers, we don't know if they're affiliated to some kind of critical infrastructure or to a specific company. Here in their post, they posted on Telegraph, which is the blog platform of Telegram. You see water pumps, but this is a different attack. And so you see that they posted some screenshots of the user interface of the GNSS receiver, and you see some of the GPS and GLONASS navigation satellites that the GNSS receiver was connected to. It's unclear what impact this attack really had. The group claimed that they got into 11 GNSS receivers and that they deleted 30 gigabytes of data on those receivers. So it's difficult to really assess whether the attack took place, because sometimes it's also important to mention that some hacktivist groups are sometimes extrapolating their actions. So you, as Matthias said, you have to trust but always verify. So that's an interesting attack, and it's also important to note that GovSec is also an actor that is involved in the war in Ukraine. So you definitely have overlap between threat actors that are taking sides and conducting operations against the space sector in the Russian-Ukrainian war and also in the Israel-Palestine conflict. So the overlap is there. Now, a lot of the space entities, when they're targeted by cyber operations, they're rarely targeted because of their space activities. Usually, because there's such an overlap between the defense and the space sector, the space and defense sector are targeted for their defense activities, and then threat actors don't really mention that they target those entities because of their space activities. Sometimes they target them and they realize or find information about space mission and they're a bit surprised. So it's also important to mention, because threat actors, they're a bit fascinated by space. They would share and information about lunar mission, about the James Webb telescopes. They like space sometimes, so they usually target those entities for their defense activities. So here you see Arabian Ghosts is mentioning its attack against Rafael and Elbit systems, which operate satellites but are also part of the defense industry in Israel. So that's the motives of the attack. So that's, and you see the screenshots of Checkhost, which proved the attack took place. So here again, it's just against a website. It does not impact space systems, but it still gives information about the threat landscape and what kind of target threat actors are interested in. Here I mentioned before that Israel was targeted a lot, and we see in threat actors a big internationalization of the conflict, which we don't necessarily see so much in other armed conflicts. So here you see one threat actor that targeted one of the ETHZ websites is from Morocco. Then you have Anonymous Vietnam from, well, Vietnam, that targeted the Israel Space Agency. Then you have Mysterious Team, which likely is from Bangladesh, that targeted Gilat Satellite Networks, which is a SATCOM company in Israel. Then you see Ketapang Grey Hat Team, which probably is from Indonesia, that targeted the Israel Space Agency. And then finally, RipperSec, which probably is from Malaysia, that targeted NASA. So again, it's always difficult to assess where they come from, because you know the best example is Anonymous Sudan, who is not really part of Anonymous and not really based in Sudan. So Sometimes it's difficult to assess where those threat actors come from, but based on the way they talk, who they interact with, at what time they post their messages, and which time zone it is, you can assume where they might come from. Then going on with the internationalization of the conflict, we see that there's definitely a ramification of various conflicts. So among hacktivist groups that take sides in the Israel-Palestine conflict, they also launch attacks that are including the India-Pakistan-Bangladesh rivalries. So India is perceived as pro-Israel by threat actors and targeted by, and so the pro-Palestine groups target India in general, not just the space sector, but in the list, space entities are targeted. So the Indian Space Research Organization, the Indian Space Agency, and the Indian Institute for Remote Sensing were targeted at least 9 times. And in 2023, ISRO declared that they were facing 100 cyber attacks per day. So of course, not all of those operations are linked to the Israeli-Palestine conflict or conducted by threat actors that are taking sides in this conflict, but some of them are. So it also gives an idea of what is the status of the threat landscape. Then you also see pro-Israel and pro-Indian threat actors that target the Bangladeshi and Pakistani space sector, which are, of course, perceived as pro-Palestine. So here you see an attack from Team UCC Operations, which is a pro-Israeli hacktivist group that targeted a Pakistani satellite GNSS receivers. Then you see an example from Moroccan Dragons, where that targeted the Indian Institute for Remote Sensing. Then another attack that targeted the Israeli Space Agency, an attack against the Bangladeshi Remote Sensing Organization, and finally an attack on Rafael from a Bangladesh civilian force. So you really see this mesh of different conflicts. And in the past few days, I tried to check hacktivist groups in the context of the Indian-Pakistan crisis that happened a few days ago, and I already found a few cyber operations against the space sector. So it really shows that whenever a crisis happens, whenever a war erupts, the space sector will be targeted. And it doesn't matter whether they target the space sector for their space activities or not, it's targeted. So if you're a space agency, you're a space company, you have to monitor geopolitical developments because you might be targeted. And entities that are targeted are not necessarily entities that are involved in the conflict or have business in those areas. Sometimes, even if you have nothing to do with this, you will still be targeted. So this is really important to take into account. Then there's different differences of how space is perceived and used between Israel and Palestine. What they have in common is that they see terrestrial mobile network as unsecure. So they're trying to escape terrestrial networks to try to use different means, and they have different approaches. So Israel has more of a high-tech approach where they don't see terrestrial systems are as secure. So when they expect physical attacks against or cyber attacks against digital infrastructure, they switch to satellite phones because they perceive it as more secure. Even though you had examples in the conflict before where you had eavesdropping on satellite phones of leaders, but they still perceive it as more secure. So, for instance, when they expected attacks on mobile networks, they advised officials to use satellite phones instead. They also provided satellite phones to citizens in border areas when they expected attacks. On the other side, Palestine has more of a low-tech approach. Which can be, of course, explained by the fact that they don't have so much space capabilities. But Hamas instructed senior figures to stop using cell phones because they don't see it as secure. And instead, they developed a network of hardwire phones that were built into the tunnels underneath Gaza. And because they're hardwired phone, it's really analog technology. It cannot be spied on. So that's also a way to kind of escape the terrestrial mobile networks. Now, what can we learn about threat actors' behavior? So first is threat actors, they are doing their own cyber threat intelligence about the space sector. And so, for instance, when in 2022 there were access sold on the dark web for a satellite imagery company, they notice it, and in their chats, they're talking about it and asking themselves whether that would be useful for them. So that's something that is interesting to notice. They also talk about the possibility to hack satellite TV channels. So that's something that shows that there's also an overlap between information campaigns and cyber campaigns. So they're also interesting into bringing their own message by potentially hacking satellite TV channels. I couldn't find any examples of actual hack, but they're still discussing it. So it gives an information about what they're interested to target. They also share on Telegram channels satellite images to show the impact of Israeli bombing. So it's also part of discourse narrative. So that's something that is important to note, because that means that threat actors, they understand how space is used in the context of military operations and what it can bring. Now, in the datasets, most operations are self-attributed, so they are claiming their own attacks, and it might give also a bit of a bias in the datasets, because I would say maybe 95 or 99% of the attacks that I monitored are self-attributed. And some of them, it might be just threat actors that are looking for attention, and maybe they didn't really target the space sector. So it's also important to keep in mind. Then it's important to say that none of the attacks actually impacted satellites in orbit. So it's mostly targeting the user segment and the IT environment of the space sector, space companies, space agencies. And finally, when we are looking to characterize threat actors in the conflict, pro-Palestine threat actors may be considered as what we can call green hat hackers. So there's a great report from the Atlantic Council on this that I encourage you to read. It means that there are threat actors that are rather new to this world. They don't have necessarily a lot of capabilities, but they're trying to build up and learn offensive capacities. So it might be that we'll see an increase in operations and an increase in sophistication in the future. So thank you very much for your attention, and happy to take any questions. Thank you.
Many, many thanks, Clémence. Please have a seat. We are so happy to have you here since, well, we've had the pleasure to follow your different researches, and I am glad that you came and presented this one, which is a really interesting one. You showed us very well the moving frontiers of space and what is space for whom and what for and why it is sometimes being targeted. Also, it was really interesting to understand how agendas sometimes overlap, how pro-Israeli and pro-Indian activists take part to different conflicts, depending on the affections they deem of other activist groups. Please, people in the audience, do not hesitate to raise questions you might have. I have one, so you've, from me, not from Connects Me, do not forget to use it. So you've identified 50 different activist groups, and you said there were little pro-Israeli activist groups. Maybe they're more pro-Indian activist group. I don't know, for first question. But I wondered if you've noticed activities from activist groups towards other activist groups. Do they target themselves somehow?
In this conflict, I didn't find examples because I didn't yet specifically look for it, but it happens sometimes that activist groups fight with each other, or that within the same group, they would have a fight internally and then divide themselves into subgroups, or that they would stop the activity of the group, and maybe some of the members will start a new group. So you see, or some of the groups then stop activities. They have a new names, but it's the same team. So it's very difficult to track. And when you do cyber threat intelligence, especially on hacktivist groups, it's really fast-paced. Telegram's groups, they might be open and accessible for a few days, a few weeks, and then deleted, or they might be taken down by Telegram because they are breaking the rules of utilization of the platform. So it's something that really changed since the arrest of Pavel Durov, the founder of Telegram. So it's also, a lot of threat actors are putting their channels in private, so they're not accessible unless you have an invite. So it's also more difficult to track operations and how they behave.
Oh yeah, and now you've raised my curiosity. How do you do to to invest those and to engage into those Telegram chats?
So I do not engage.
You do not, okay.
I do not try to contact threat actors. I don't take part in any malicious activity. I just go on open source information, so open channels and open groups that you guys can access as well. I don't have any inside informations, but those groups, they want also their informations to be publicly accessible, and some might be looking for media attention or might want to show their capabilities. So that's mostly, how I do it.
And do they find media attention? Because, well, you've been talking about CYSAT, which was carried out in the early hours of the Ukrainian the war against Ukraine. But all those positions and those actions from activist groups mediatized somehow?
It really depends. There's not so much spotlight on the space sector. So I guess attacks that gather media intentions are more against critical infrastructure or things that have impact on the civilian population. And as we said yesterday, we often forget about space and how we rely on space for every aspect of our lives because it's a bit invisible. But when it's more concrete, then media attentions might be gathered. Yeah.
And focusing now on the space sector, as an answer to the actions and the threats caused by pro-Palestinian hacktivist groups, have you noticed somehow as a retaliation measure that Israel authorities could shut down the satellites used by Palestinian authorities, for instance, or not?
It's difficult to say because there's not really any information. However, the satellites that are used by Palestinian users are not Palestine satellites. So that would mean that Israel would target a satellite of another country. So that might make things even worse. And I think things are already complicated enough. So I couldn't find, fortunately, any example of that sort.
Thank you very much, Clémence Poirier. I think we can give you another warm round of applause.